The morning mist rolled through the Smoky Mountains like the breath of ghosts, thick and cold against the face of a man who had seen too many mornings like this one. David Morgan stood at the edge of the tree line, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that trembled slightly despite his best efforts to keep them still. He was 68 years old, a fact that his body reminded him of every single day now, but his eyes were still sharp as he scanned the valley below, where white-tailed deer moved through the undergrowth like shadows given form. Behind him, the cabin he had built with his own hands 30 years ago sat quiet in the pre-dawn darkness, smoke curling from the stone chimney into the Tennessee sky. This was home. This was peace. This was everything he had fought for in deserts half a world away when he was young and his hands were steady, and the weight of killing another man had not yet settled into his bones like arthritis. The Parkinson's had started 2 years ago. Just a tremor in his right hand at first, barely noticeable, easy to ignore. But it had spread like a slow fire, creeping into his left hand, into his legs sometimes, into the core of who he had been. Colonel David Eagle Morgan, United States Army Rangers, retired. 178 confirmed kills during Desert Storm and the missions that followed. A legend among snipers, a ghost in the sand who had stalked the enemy with patience that bordered on supernatural. Now he could barely hold a coffee cup without spilling it. The sound of footsteps on the porch boards brought him back to the present. He did not turn around. He did not need to. He knew the weight of those steps, the rhythm of that walk, the presence of the only person in the world who could move that quietly without trying. His daughter. Rachel Morgan appeared beside him, her own cup of coffee steaming in the cold air. She was 27 years old, lean and strong in the way that came from years of military training, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, her green eyes mirror images of his own. She wore civilian clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt, but she stood like a soldier. She could not help it. It was in her blood now, just as it had been in his. They stood together in silence watching the deer. This was their ritual when she came home on leave. No words needed, just the mountain, the morning, and the understanding that passed between father and daughter without language. Finally, David spoke, his voice rougher than it used to be. "Tell me about the last mission." Rachel took a sip of her coffee, considering her words. She never lied to him, never sugarcoated the reality of what she did. He had trained her too well for that. Hindu Kush. Overwatch for a Delta team extracting a high-value target. 19 hostiles neutralized. No friendly casualties. In and out in 42 minutes. David nodded slowly, his hands shook against the cup, coffee rippling in small waves. Distance? Rachel's voice was steady, professional. Longest shot was 630 meters. Wind variable, elevation extreme. Had to adjust for temperature differential between valley and ridge. And you made the shot. It was not a question. David knew his daughter. He had taught her everything he knew about the craft of precision shooting, about reading terrain, about becoming one with the rifle until you could not tell where the weapon ended and you began. She had taken those lessons and gone beyond them, developing instincts he had never quite possessed, a kind of sixth sense for the geometry of death. "I made the shot," Rachel confirmed quietly. They stood in silence again. Somewhere in the valley, a hawk cried out, its call echoing off the ridges. David watched it circle, a dark shape against the lightning sky. Hawks had always been his daughter's favorite. When she was 8 years old and he had first put a rifle in her hands, teaching her to shoot tin cans off fence posts, she had chosen her own call sign before she even knew what a call sign was. "I want to be a hawk," she had said, her small hands struggling with the weight of the .22 rifle. Because hawks see everything, and nobody sees them coming. Now, 19 years later, that call sign was official. Staff Sergeant Rachel Hawk Morgan, United States Army, Sniper School Distinguished Graduate, 38 combat missions, 41 confirmed kills. The best Overwatch operator in her unit, possibly in the entire Army. And still his little girl, who used to fall asleep on his lap while he told her stories about her mother. David's hands trembled harder, and he gripped the coffee cup tighter, willing them to be still. Rachel noticed. She always noticed, but she said nothing, respecting his pride the way he had taught her to respect the pride of every warrior, even in decline. "How long you got this time?" David asked, changing the subject. 2 weeks, then back to Bragg for reassignment briefing. David nodded. 2 weeks. 14 days with his daughter before she went back into harm's way, back into the dance of distance and precision and the terrible mathematics of taking human life. He wanted to tell her to stay. He wanted to tell her to leave the army, to find a man, to give him grandchildren, to live a normal life far from the sound of gunfire. But he knew better. She was a warrior. It was not something she did, it was something she was. And he had made her that way. The sun broke over the ridge, golden light spilling across the valley, and the deer scattered into the deeper woods. David turned toward the cabin, his movements slower than they used to be, and Rachel followed. Inside, the warmth of the wood stove wrapped around them like a blanket, and David settled into his worn leather chair, the one that held the shape of his body after 30 years of use. Rachel moved to the fireplace, where 3 rifles hung on pegs above the mantel. The leftmost was her great-grandfather's Springfield, carried in the trenches of France in 1918. The center rifle was David's Gulf War-era M24, the weapon that had ended 178 lives in the deserts of Kuwait and Iraq. Each kill recorded in a small notebook David kept locked in a drawer upstairs. The rightmost rifle was empty space, waiting for Rachel's service weapon when her time came to retire, to pass the legacy forward to whatever came next. 3 generations of Morgans, 3 generations of warriors, 3 generations of people who had decided that between the innocent and the wolves, there had to be someone willing to stand in the gap with a rifle and the skill to use it. Rachel traced her fingers along the stock of the M24, feeling the scratches and dents that told the story of a war fought before she was born. David watched her from his chair, remembering the weight of that rifle, the smell of gun oil and desert sand, the way it had felt to look through the scope and see another human being, a young man probably not much different from himself, and make the decision to end that life with a single squeeze of the trigger. "Tell me about the first one," Rachel said quietly, not turning around. David's jaw tightened. They had never spoken about this. In all her years of training, all her deployments, all her kills, he had never told her about his first. It was a wall between them, invisible but present, the one story he had kept to himself. "Why now?" Rachel turned to face him, her green eyes serious. "Because I need to know that you carried it too. The weight, the faces, the wondering if it ever gets easier." David was quiet for a long moment. His hands shook in his lap, and he could not stop them. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, a sound like distant breathing. Finally, he spoke. 1991, February. I was 35 years old. We were running reconnaissance deep in Iraqi territory north of Kuwait City. Intel said there was a Soviet advisor in the area, training Iraqi Republican Guard snipers. Our orders were to locate and eliminate. David paused, lost in memory, seeing the desert again, feeling the oppressive heat even in February, the weight of his gear, the constant tension of knowing that death could come from any direction at any moment. I tracked him for 3 days. He was good, really good. Better than most of the Iraqi snipers I had faced. He knew how to move, how to hide, how to read terrain even in open desert. I realized he was not just an advisor. He was hunting too, hunting me. Rachel sat down on the floor in front of his chair, cross-legged like she used to do as a child when he told her bedtime stories. But this was no bedtime story. On the 3rd day, I found his hide. He had set up on a ridge overlooking a road our convoy would use. Perfect position, perfect camouflage. He could have killed 3 or 4 of my team before we even knew where he was. But I got there first. I had the shot. 750 meters, through heat shimmer, with wind moving sand between us. David's voice grew softer, more distant. I looked at him through my scope for a long time. He was young, maybe early 30s. He had a photo tucked into his vest. I could see it from 750 meters away. His family, probably. A woman and children. He was someone's husband, someone's father. And I was about to make them grieve. "Did you hesitate?" Rachel asked. David met her eyes for about 3 seconds. Then I remembered that if I did not take the shot, he would kill my brothers, my friends, Americans who had families too. So I squeezed the trigger, and Ivan Sokolov died without ever knowing I was there. Rachel's eyes widened. "You knew his name?" David nodded slowly. "Afterward, I checked his body. He had papers, identification. Ivan Sokolov, former Soviet Army, sniper instructor on contract with Iraqi forces. 37 years old. He had a letter in his pocket, half finished, written to his wife. I read it. I should not have, but I did. He told her he loved her, that he missed his son and daughter, that this contract would pay enough to buy them a better apartment in Moscow. The room was very quiet. The fire crackled in the stove. I have carried Ivan Sokolov for 33 years, David said quietly. Every day. He was the first, but he was not the last. 178 men died because I was better at killing than they were. And I do not regret it because I was protecting my brothers, protecting my country, but I also do not forget it. Ever. Rachel reached up and took her father's trembling hand in both of hers, steadying it. Thank you for telling me. David looked down at his daughter, this fierce, capable woman who had inherited his skills and his burden, and felt something twist in his chest. Pride, fear, love, regret. All of it tangled together in a knot he could not untie. The weight never gets lighter, Rachel. You just get stronger at carrying it. They sat together like that for a while, father and daughter, warrior and warrior, two people who had seen things most people could not imagine and had made choices most people would never have to make. Finally, Rachel stood, releasing his hand gently. I'm going for a run. Clear my head. You want anything from town? David shook his head. Just you? Back safe. Rachel smiled, the expression transforming her serious face into something younger, more open. Always, old man, always. She left through the back door, and David heard her footsteps fade into the distance. He sat alone in his chair, staring at the rifles above the mantel, thinking about legacy and what it meant to pass something forward to the next generation. Was it a gift or a curse? Was he proud of what his daughter had become? Or did he grieve for the normal life she would never have? Both, he decided, always both. His phone buzzed in his pocket, an unfamiliar sensation. He rarely got calls anymore. Most of his old unit was dead or scattered, and he had never been one for staying in touch. He pulled out the phone, squinting at the screen, and saw a number he did not recognize with a Virginia area code. He almost did not answer, but something made him press the button, some instinct that had kept him alive in the desert all those years ago. Colonel Morgan? The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, military. Speaking, this is Colonel Sarah Brennan, Joint Special Operations Command. I apologize for the early call, sir, but we have a situation that requires your expertise. David's eyebrows rose. JSOC did not call retired Rangers with Parkinson's disease unless something very unusual was happening. I am retired, Colonel. Have been for 16 years. I am aware of your status, sir, but this situation involves your daughter, Staff Sergeant Rachel Morgan, and we believe your specific knowledge may be crucial to mission success. David sat up straighter, his heart rate increasing despite his best efforts to stay calm. What kind of mission? Colonel Brennan hesitated, and in that pause, David heard volumes. Sir, are you familiar with a Viktor Markov? The name hit David like a physical blow. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in 33 years. His hands, already trembling from Parkinson's, began to shake harder. Coffee sloshed over the rim of the forgotten cup in his lap. How do you know that name? Colonel Brennan's voice was careful, measured. Because Viktor Markov is currently operating a militia compound in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. He is holding 3 American hostages, all former intelligence officers. And he has specifically requested, through back channels, that the United States send Colonel David Morgan to negotiate their release. David's mind raced. Viktor Markov, Ivan Sokolov's best friend, the other Soviet sniper advisor working with Iraqi forces. The man who had sworn over his friend's dead body that he would one day find the American who had killed Ivan and make him pay. The man who had supposedly died in the chaos after Desert Storm ended. He is alive. It was not a question. Very much so, sir. And according to our intelligence, he has been tracking you for decades. This hostage situation may be a trap designed specifically to draw you out. David stood up slowly, his legs unsteady, and walked to the window. Outside, the mountains stretched endlessly, beautiful and indifferent. Somewhere out there, Rachel was running, unaware that the past was about to collide with the present in ways neither of them could have predicted. Why does this involve my daughter? Colonel Brennan took a breath. Because SEAL Team 3 has been assigned to extract the hostages, they have requested sniper overwatch for the operation. Your daughter has been selected for that role. She deploys in 72 hours. David felt cold despite the warmth of the cabin. Viktor Markov was not just a ghost from his past. He was a highly trained, highly motivated enemy who had spent 3 decades nursing a grudge. And now Rachel was going to be inserted directly into his operational area, walking into what might be the most personal and dangerous trap imaginable. Does she know? David asked. Does Rachel know about Markov's connection to me? Not yet, sir. We wanted to brief you first. We are hoping you might be willing to serve as a consultant on this operation. Your knowledge of Markov's tactics, his psychology, could be invaluable." David closed his eyes. He was 68 years old with Parkinson's disease. He had not fired a rifle in anger in decades. He was a broken-down old warrior who could barely hold a coffee cup steady. And yet Viktor Markov, his old enemy, the man who had hunted him through nightmares for 33 years, was alive and threatening his daughter. There was really only one answer he could give. "When do I leave?" "Sir, you understand this would be strictly in an advisory capacity. You would not be operational. Your medical condition." Colonel Brennan let the sentence trail off, tactful but clear. "I understand. When do I leave?" There was a pause, then a sound that might have been approval or respect, or both. "Transport leaves from McGee-Tyson Airport in Knoxville at 0800 tomorrow. Briefing at Fort Campbell by 1400. Your daughter will be read in at the same time. I will be there. Thank you, Colonel Morgan. Your country appreciates your continued service." David ended in the call and stood at the window, watching the mountains, thinking about a young Soviet sniper named Ivan Sokolov and the letter to his wife that would never be sent. Thinking about Viktor Markov, who had loved Ivan like a brother and had promised revenge. Thinking about his daughter, who was about to walk into a web spun by a spider who had been waiting decades for exactly this moment. The front door opened and Rachel came in, flushed from her run, pulling earbuds from her ears. "You okay, Dad? You look like you saw a ghost." David turned to face her, the strong, capable woman who was his entire world, his legacy, his greatest achievement, and his deepest fear. "Sit down, Hawk. We need to talk about your next mission. And we need to talk about a man named Viktor Markov." Rachel's expression shifted from casual to alert in an instant, the way it always did when she sensed danger. "Who is Viktor Markov?" David moved to the mantel and took down his M24 rifle, feeling the familiar weight in his hands. The balance, the memories. His hands shook, making the rifle waver, but he held it anyway. "He is the reason I never forgot my first kill. He is the man who swore to kill me 33 years ago. And he is the man who is going to try to use you to get to me." He turned to face his daughter, meeting her eyes with all the intensity he had once used to line up impossible shots in impossible conditions. "And in 3 days, you and I are going to Montana to finish something that started before you were born." Rachel stood slowly, her expression unreadable, processing information the way she had been trained to process battlefield intelligence. Analyzing, calculating, preparing. "Tell me everything." David sat back down in his chair, the rifle across his lap, and began to speak. He told her about Ivan Sokolov, about the 3-day hunt through the Iraqi desert, about the letter in the dead man's pocket. He told her about Viktor Markov, about the Soviet sniper instructor who had trained enemy shooters to kill Americans, about the friendship between Viktor and Ivan that had been forged in the brutal crucible of war. He told her about the vow Viktor had made, standing over Ivan's body, speaking in Russian that David had not understood at the time but had learned later from intelligence reports. "I will find the American who did this. I will take from him what he took from me, and I will make him understand the price of every trigger pull." Rachel listened without interrupting, her face growing harder, more focused, as the story unfolded. When David finished, she was silent for a long moment, staring at the rifles on the wall. Finally, she spoke. "He has been hunting you for 33 years. David nodded. "And now he has found me." "Yes." Rachel's jaw tightened, and David saw something in her expression that reminded him of himself at her age. That absolute, unwavering determination that made the difference between good snipers and legendary ones. "Then we finish it. Together." David wanted to argue, wanted to tell her to request reassignment, to stay far away from this personal war that had nothing to do with her. But he knew his daughter. She would not back down any more than he would. She was a Morgan, and Morgans did not run from threats. They ran toward them. The rest of the day passed in a strange blur. Rachel went into town and came back with supplies. David made phone calls to old contacts, pulling strings that still existed even after 16 years of retirement, ensuring that when he arrived at Fort Campbell, his access would be absolute. They did not talk much. There was not much to say. They both understood what was coming. That night, they sat together on the porch as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded David of tracer fire in the desert, of burning oil fields, of all the beautiful and terrible things he had seen in war. Rachel broke the silence first. "Are you afraid?" David considered the question, his trembling hands wrapped around a mug of herbal tea that was supposed to help with the Parkinson's but never actually did. I have been afraid every day since you joined the army. Not for me, for you. Because I know what this life costs. I know what it takes from you, piece by piece, until you are not sure who you are anymore without a rifle in your hands. He paused, then continued. But am I afraid of Viktor Markov? No, I'm angry. I'm tired. I'm too old for this. But I am not afraid. Fear is for people who have something left to lose. And all I have left is you, Hawk. Which means I will walk into hell itself if that is what it takes to keep you safe. Rachel reached over and took his trembling hand, holding it steady between both of hers. I do not need you to keep me safe, Dad. I need you to trust me, to trust the training you gave me, to know that I am not a little girl with a .22 rifle anymore. I am a warrior, just like you taught me to be. David looked at his daughter, seeing her clearly in the fading light, and felt his heart break and swell at the same time. I know, Hawk. God help me, I know. They sat together as darkness fell, father and daughter, two warriors on the eve of battle, bound by blood and training and love, and all the complicated things that could never quite be said in words. The next morning they drove to Knoxville in David's old pickup truck, the mountains falling away behind them as they descended into the valley. Rachel drove, her hands steady on the wheel, while David sat in the passenger seat and watched the landscape roll by, wondering if he would ever see these hills again. At the airport, they met the military transport that would take them to Fort Campbell. The pilot, a young captain who could not have been more than 30, saluted crisply. Colonel Morgan, Staff Sergeant Morgan, welcome aboard. Flight time is approximately 90 minutes. Colonel Brennan sends her regards and says she looks forward to briefing you personally. They boarded the small jet, settling into the Spartan seats, and the engines roared to life. As the plane lifted off, David looked out the window at Tennessee falling away below them, the mountains and forests where he had found peace after war, where he had raised his daughter alone after his wife's death in childbirth, where he had tried to build a life separate from the violence he had known. But violence had found him anyway. It always did. That was the thing about war. It never really ended. It just paused. And now, 33 years later, the bill had come due. Rachel must have seen something in his expression because she leaned close and spoke quietly under the sound of the engines. "We're going to be okay, Dad." David turned to look at her, this fierce, capable woman who carried his blood and his training and his legacy, and he wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that they would walk into Viktor Markov's trap and walk back out again, that the old Russians' vendetta would end without tragedy, that this story could have a clean, simple ending. But David had lived too long and seen too much to believe in simple endings. Still, he smiled at his daughter and nodded. "I know, Hawk, I know." The plane flew north toward Kentucky, toward Fort Campbell, toward mission briefings and tactical planning and all the machinery of modern warfare. But in his mind, David was already in Montana, in the mountains, with a rifle in his hands and an old enemy waiting in the shadows. Viktor Markov had been hunting him for 33 years. Now the hunter was about to become the hunted. Now the old Russian was about to learn what it meant to threaten a Morgan. Now it was time to finish what had started in an Iraqi desert a lifetime ago. The plane cut through clouds, heading north, carrying two warriors toward a confrontation that had been delayed but never forgotten. While below them, America stretched vast and indifferent, a country that had no idea two of its defenders were about to pay the price for decisions made decades before they were born. This was the cost of legacy. This was the weight of the rifle. This was what it meant to be a warrior in a world that never stopped producing enemies and never ran out of reasons to fight. And somewhere in the mountains of Montana, Viktor Markov waited, patient and deadly, the way all true snipers waited. The way David had taught his daughter to wait. The way the past always waited, holding its breath until the moment came to strike. Fort Campbell sprawled across the Kentucky landscape like a small city built for the single purpose of making warriors. David Morgan had not been here in 16 years, but the smell was the same. Gun oil and diesel fuel and sweat and the particular tension that came from thousands of young men and women preparing to do violence in the name of their country. It was a smell that lived in his memory, that sometimes woke him in the night, that he had thought he would never experience again. He was wrong about a lot of things, it seemed. The briefing room was exactly what he expected. Gray walls, fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical persistence, a large screen at the front showing satellite imagery of mountains David had never seen, but could already read like a book. 20 years as a ranger sniper had taught him how to see terrain the way other people saw faces, understanding the lines and shadows, the places where death could hide, the paths that looked safe but were not. Colonel Sarah Brennan stood at the front of the room, a woman in her late 40s with iron gray hair, cut military short, and eyes that had seen things she would never talk about at dinner parties. She was talking to a cluster of SEAL operators, men in their 30s and 40s who radiated the particular confidence that came from being the best at what they did and knowing it. They wore civilian clothes for now, but there was no mistaking what they were. Warriors recognize warriors the way wolves recognize other wolves. Rachel sat beside David in the front row, her posture perfect, her face a mask of professional calm. But David could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands rested flat on her thighs instead of relaxed. She was nervous, not about the mission, about what was coming, about sitting in this room with her father while strangers learned that their family history was tangled up with international terrorism and 33-year-old vendettas. Colonel Brennan noticed them and crossed the room, her hand extended. "Colonel Morgan, thank you for coming on such short notice." David stood, his legs unsteady, and shook her hand. Her grip was firm, professional, and she did not comment on the tremor in his fingers. "Ma'am, this is my daughter, Staff Sergeant Rachel Morgan." Brennan turned to Rachel and offered the same firm handshake. "Sergeant Morgan, I have read your file. Impressive work in the Hindu Kush last month." "Thank you, ma'am." Brennan gestured to the SEAL team. "Let me introduce you to the men you will be working with. This is Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, SEAL Team 3 Commander." A man in his early 40s stepped forward, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from stone and then left out in the weather for a few years. His handshake was crushing, the kind meant to establish dominance, and David met it with the same pressure despite the Parkinson's making his hand shake in the man's grip. "Colonel Morgan, I have heard stories about you. Desert Storm, the Sand Ghost." David's jaw tightened. He hated that nickname. Some journalist had given it to him in '92 after a particularly successful string of missions, and it had followed him ever since, turning his work into something romantic instead of what it actually was. Killing. Necessary killing, justified killing, but still killing. "That was a long time ago, Colonel Patterson." Patterson's eyes flicked to David's trembling hands, then back to his face, and David saw the calculation there. This SEAL commander was wondering if he could trust an old man with Parkinson's disease, wondering if David would be an asset or a liability, wondering if the legendary sniper from Desert Storm was just another broken-down veteran who should have stayed home. David met his gaze and held it, putting 50 years of combat experience into that look. And after a moment, Patterson nodded, a gesture that might have been respect or might have been something else. Patterson turned to Rachel, and his expression shifted slightly, becoming more professional but also more guarded. "Staff Sergeant Morgan, I understand you are our overwatch for this operation." "Yes, sir. I have reviewed your record. Distinguished graduate from sniper school, 38 combat missions, 41 confirmed kills. Impressive numbers for someone your age." There was something in his tone that made David's shoulders tense. Not quite skepticism, but not quite acceptance either. Something careful, measured, like a man walking on ice he did not trust. "I do my job, sir," Rachel said evenly. Patterson nodded slowly. "I am sure you do, but I need to be clear about something, Sergeant. This mission is high risk, high visibility. 3 American lives are on the line. I need to know that when things go sideways, and they always go sideways, you can handle the pressure. That you are here because you are the best available sniper, not because of your family connections." The room went very quiet. David felt his hands curl into fists despite the tremor, felt anger rising in his chest like acid. But before he could speak, Rachel stood up, her spine straight, her voice calm and absolutely cold. "With respect, sir, I have never asked for special treatment because of my father's name. I graduated at the top of my class on merit. I have made every shot that mattered under fire. If you do not trust my abilities based on my record, that is your prerogative. But do not insult me by suggesting I am here as a favor." Patterson's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Approval, maybe, or recognition that he had pushed too hard and gotten exactly the response he deserved. "Fair enough, Sergeant. I needed to know you could handle pushback. Looks like you can." Colonel Brennan cleared her throat, breaking the tension. "If we are done measuring, gentleman and lady, We have a briefing to conduct. Take your seats." The room settled, and Brennan moved to the screen at the front. With a click of a remote, the satellite imagery zoomed in on a section of Montana wilderness, mountains and forests, and a single compound visible as a collection of buildings in a valley. This is the Bitterroot Range in western Montana. Remote, rugged, historically used for mining operations that shut down in the 1980s. 6 weeks ago, a militia group calling themselves the Free Mountain Patriots established a compound here. We initially assessed them as low threat, just another group of survivalists playing soldier in the woods. Brennan clicked again, and the image changed to surveillance photos of armed men in tactical gear. 2 weeks ago, that assessment changed. The Free Mountain Patriots kidnapped 3 former CIA officers from a restaurant in Missoula. All 3 were involved in Middle Eastern operations in the 90s. We now believe the militia is a front for a more sophisticated operation led by this man. The screen changed again, showing a face that made David's breath catch in his throat. Viktor Markov. Older now, his hair white instead of dark, his face lined with age, but the eyes were the same. Hard, cold, patient. The eyes of a man who knew how to wait for what he wanted and never forgot a promise. Viktor Markov, Brennan continued, age 67, former Soviet Army specializing in sniper operations and unconventional warfare. Officially listed as killed in action during the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989. Obviously, that intelligence was incorrect. She paused, looking directly at David. What we learned 3 days ago is that Markov has been operating in the shadows for decades. Arms dealing, mercenary training, intelligence brokering. He has stayed off the radar by being very, very careful. Until now. Now he has surfaced, and he has specifically requested that Colonel David Morgan be part of any negotiation for the hostages' release. Patterson leaned forward. Why Morgan specifically? Brennan looked at David, giving him the choice to tell the story himself. David stood slowly, his legs protesting, and faced the room full of elite warriors who were all younger and stronger and steadier than he would ever be again. Desert Storm, 1991. I killed Markov's best friend, a Soviet sniper advisor named Ivan Sokolov. Markov swore revenge. I thought he was dead. Apparently, he has been tracking me for 33 years, waiting for the right moment. The room absorbed this information in silence. One of the younger SEALs, a man with a shaved head and a scar across his jaw, spoke up. So this whole thing is a trap. To get to you. David nodded. That would be my assessment. Patterson's expression had gone hard, calculating. Then we are walking into an ambush designed by a man who has had 3 decades to plan it. With all due respect, Colonel Morgan, maybe you should sit this one out. No point giving Markov what he wants. Before David could respond, Rachel stood up again, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. With respect, sir, my father knows Markov's tactics. He knows how the man thinks, how he operates. Taking him off this mission would be like going into a minefield without a map. Yes, it is personal, but that does not make it stupid. It makes it necessary. Patterson looked at her for a long moment, then at David, then back at Brennan. Your call, Colonel. Brennan did not hesitate. Colonel Morgan goes. As a consultant and terrain expert, he will not be part of the assault team, but he will be in the operational area. His knowledge of Markov could mean the difference between success and failure. She clicked the remote again, and the screen showed a tactical map with overlays marking distances, elevations, and fields of fire. Here's the plan. SEAL Team 3 inserts via helicopter at 0300 2 days from now. Approach on foot to within 1 kilometer of the target compound. Staff Sergeant Morgan establishes overwatch position here, on this ridge, 800 meters from the compound with clear line of sight. Colonel Morgan accompanies her as spotter and tactical advisor. David studied the map, his mind automatically calculating angles and distances, seeing the terrain in 3 dimensions, even from the flat satellite image. The ridge was good. Elevation advantage, natural cover, multiple escape routes. Whoever had planned this knew their business. SEAL team conducts reconnaissance, confirms hostage location, and executes rapid assault to secure and extract. Overwatch provides suppressing fire as needed. Extract via helicopter from designated landing zone 2 kilometers north. Total time on ground, 90 minutes. Patterson spoke up. What is Markov's force strength? Unknown precisely. Surveillance suggests approximately 40 militia members in the compound at any given time. Unknown. How many are trained fighters versus ideological tourists playing dress-up? But we have to assume Markov has hardened his inner circle, Expect at least a dozen serious threats. One of the SEALs whistled low. 40-8. I have had worse odds. Brennan's expression did not change. This operation is voluntary. Anyone who wants out, now is the time. No one moved. These men had not become Navy SEALs by backing away from bad odds. Good. You have 48 hours to prepare. Wheels up at 0200, day after tomorrow. Oh, Colonel Morgan, a word in private? The room emptied, SEALs filing out to begin their preparation rituals. The things warriors did before going into combat that had nothing to do with gear checks and everything to do with making peace with mortality. David and Rachel remained, along with Brennan and Patterson. Brennan waited until the door closed, then turned to David with an expression that was almost apologetic. Colonel Morgan, I need to be direct. Your Parkinson's is documented in your medical records. If this goes to combat, if you are forced into a shooting situation, can you still make the shots that matter? David wanted to lie, wanted to say yes without hesitation, to project the confidence he had carried for 50 years, but he was too old and too tired for lies. I do not know, ma'am. My hands shake, some days worse than others, but my eyes are still good, my judgment is still sound, and I know Victor Markov better than anyone else alive. That has to count for something. Brennan nodded slowly. It counts for a lot, Colonel. Just understand that if things go kinetic, you defer to the operators. You are there to advise, not to fight. Clear? Clear, ma'am. Patterson cleared his throat. With respect, Colonel Brennan, I am still not comfortable with this. Having civilians, even retired military, in the operational area complicates things. And having them be father and daughter complicates it even more. Rachel's voice was ice. I am not a civilian, sir. I am a trained sniper with combat experience. And my personal relationship with Colonel Morgan is irrelevant to my ability to do my job. Patterson turned to face her directly. Is it? If things go wrong, if your father is injured or killed, can you maintain focus? Can you take the shots that need to be taken while your father is bleeding out 20 feet away? The question hung in the air like a physical thing. David wanted to step in, wanted to defend his daughter, but this was her moment, her test, and she had to meet it herself. Rachel met Patterson's eyes without flinching. Sir, my father trained me. He taught me that being a sniper is not about emotions. It is about mathematics, distance, wind, elevation, timing. The target does not care if I am scared or angry or grieving. The target just exists or stops existing based on whether I do my job correctly. So yes, sir, if my father is bleeding out 20 feet away, I will take the shots that need to be taken, because that is what he trained me to do. David felt something twist in his chest. Pride, fear, recognition that his daughter was exactly what he had made her. A weapon, a tool, a warrior who could set aside everything human in service of the mission. He had done that to her, and he could not decide if he should be proud or ashamed. Patterson held Rachel's gaze for another long moment, then nodded. All right, you are in. But understand this, both of you, if I see anything that suggests personal feelings are compromising operational effectiveness, I will pull you both off the mission immediately. I do not care about your service records or your family legacy. I care about getting my men home alive and completing the mission. Clear? Crystal, sir, Rachel said. David just nodded. There was nothing to say. Patterson was right. In the brutal arithmetic of combat, personal feelings were a luxury no one could afford. Brennan looked between them, her expression unreadable. Dismissed. Get some rest. You deploy in 36 hours. David and Rachel left the briefing room and walked out into the afternoon sun. Fort Campbell bustled around them, soldiers going about their business, the machinery of military life grinding forward with indifferent momentum. They walked in silence to the temporary quarters they had been assigned, a small building with 2 Spartan rooms and a shared bathroom. Inside, Rachel sat on the edge of the narrow bed and put her face in her hands. For a moment, she looked young, vulnerable, not like a trained killer, but like the little girl who used to fall asleep on David's lap while he told her stories. You okay, Hawk? Rachel looked up, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been anger. Am I okay, Dad? We are walking into a trap designed by a man who has spent 33 years planning to kill you. Patterson thinks I am here because of nepotism. The entire mission is built on the assumption that you can still function in combat despite the Parkinson's. And in 36 hours, we are going to find out if any of this is true or if we are just fooling ourselves. David sat down beside her, his body protesting the movement, and put his arm around her shoulders the way he used to when she was small. I will not lie to you, Hawk. I am scared, not for me, for you. Because Viktor Markov is smart and patient, and he has had 3 decades to prepare for this. And I brought you into it just by being your father. Rachel leaned into him, and for a moment they were not warriors discussing tactics. They were just family, holding on to each other in a world that was about to become very dangerous. You did not bring me into this, Rachel said quietly. I chose this life. I chose to follow you. And if I die in Montana, it will not be your fault. It will be because I was a warrior, and warriors die in combat. That is the deal we all make. David held his daughter and wondered when she had become so much stronger than him. When had the roles reversed? When had she become the one comforting him instead of the other way around? The answer, of course, was that it had been gradual. Year by year, mission by mission, she had taken the lessons he taught her and forged them into something uniquely her own. She was not just his daughter anymore. She was her own person, her own warrior. And maybe that was the hardest part of being a parent. Letting go, watching them fly into danger and trusting that you taught them well enough to survive it. They sat together for a while, father and daughter, until the sun began to set and the shadows grew long across Fort Campbell. Then Rachel pulled away, wiped her eyes, and stood up. I am going to the range. Need to zero my rifle, run through my pre-mission checklist. Want company? Rachel smiled, and it was genuine. Always. They walked together to the base rifle range, a long stretch of open ground with targets at various distances. The range master was a grizzled sergeant who looked like he had been born behind a rifle and would probably die the same way. He took one look at David's retired rank insignia and snapped to attention. Colonel, range is yours if you need it. Thank you, Sergeant. My daughter needs to zero her weapon. I am just here to observe. The sergeant looked at Rachel with the kind of skepticism David had seen 1,000 times before. The look that said women do not belong on rifle ranges, that shooting is a man's work, that she would probably flinch and miss and prove what he already believed. David had learned to enjoy the moment when men like that sergeant were proven wrong. Rachel unpacked her rifle case with the precise movements of a professional. Her weapon was an M2010 enhanced sniper rifle, the standard issue for Army snipers, chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. It was a serious weapon capable of reaching out past 1,000 meters with the right shooter behind it. She assembled it quickly, efficiently, checking each component with the care of someone who understood that in combat, equipment failure meant death. She loaded a magazine, settled into a prone position, and looked through the scope at a target 600 meters downrange. David knelt beside her, his body protesting, but he pushed through the discomfort. This was ritual. This was what they did together. Wind? Rachel asked. 5 to 7 miles per hour left to right. Pressure steady. Temperature dropping as the sun sets. Call it 1 minute of angle left. Rachel adjusted her scope, breathed in, breathed out, and in the space between heartbeats, she fired. The rifle kicked against her shoulder with controlled violence, and 600 meters away, the target sprouted a hole dead center. She fired 4 more times, each round landing within a 2-inch group at the center of the target. Perfect, professional, the kind of shooting that made sergeants shut their mouths and pay attention. The range master walked over, looked downrange through binoculars, and whistled low. That is some fine shooting, Sergeant. Rachel cleared her weapon and stood up, her face neutral. Just doing my job, Sergeant. David felt a familiar surge of pride watching his daughter work. She had taken everything he taught her and made it better, refined it, turned it into something approaching art. She was a better shot than he had ever been, even before the Parkinsons. She had his instincts and her own discipline, and the combination was formidable. They stayed at the range until dark, Rachel working through various distances and positions, David spotting for her, calling wind and distance, falling into the rhythm they had developed over years of training together. It was peaceful in its way. The world narrowed to the rifle, the target, the mathematics of death delivered at distance. When they finally packed up and headed back to quarters, David's legs were screaming and his hands were shaking worse than usual, but his mind felt clear. This was who he was. This was what he knew. And in 36 hours, he would need every bit of that knowledge. That night, David lay in his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the base around him. Somewhere, young soldiers were preparing for deployment. Somewhere, wives and husbands and children were saying goodbye, not knowing if it was the last goodbye. Somewhere, the machinery of war was turning, indifferent and relentless. He thought about Viktor Markov, wondered what the old Russian was doing right now. Preparing, probably. Planning, anticipating every move David might make, every tactic he might employ. They had never met face to face, but they knew each other intimately through the craft they shared. Sniper and sniper, hunter and hunter. And in the middle of it all was Rachel, his daughter, his legacy, walking into a trap that existed because David had pulled a trigger 33 years ago in a desert half a world away. The weight of that settled over him like a physical thing, and he wondered, not for the first time, if every bullet carried consequences that echoed forward through time, creating ripples that never quite died out. He must have slept, because suddenly it was morning and Rachel was shaking his shoulder, her face tense. "Dad, get up. Something is wrong." David sat up, his mind instantly alert despite his body's protests. "What is it?" Patterson just called an emergency briefing. Markov sent a message. They dressed quickly and hurried to the briefing room, where Patterson and his team were already assembled around a laptop. Colonel Brennan was there too, her expression grim. On the screen was a video feed, grainy but clear enough. It showed the three hostages, bound and kneeling in what looked like a warehouse or barn. They were bruised but alive. And standing behind them, calm as death itself, was Viktor Markov. He looked older than in the surveillance photos, his white hair long and tied back, his face deeply lined, but he stood straight and his hands were steady. When he spoke, his English was perfect, touched with only the faintest Russian accent. "Colonel David Morgan, I know you are watching this. I know you are already on your way." "Good, that is what I wanted. You took from me the brother I never had. You killed a good man, a warrior, for no reason except that politicians sent you to a desert where you did not belong." Markov paused and something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe, or memory. "For 33 years I have waited. I have built a life in the shadows, always watching, always patient. And now you are old, sick, weak. Your hands shake like a drunk. You are a shell of what you once were, and I find I do not want to kill you quickly. I want you to understand what you took from me. I want you to feel what I felt when Ivan died." He placed a hand on the nearest hostage's shoulder, almost gentle. "So I will give you a chance, David Morgan. Come to me. Walk into my home. Face me like the warrior you once were. And maybe, I will let these innocent people live. But if you send your soldiers without you, if you try to be clever, I will execute all three hostages and disappear back into shadows you will never find." Markov looked directly into the camera, and his eyes were absolutely cold. "You have 48 hours. The clock is already running. And David, bring your daughter. I want her to watch what happens to legends when they grow old." The video ended. The briefing room was silent. Patterson spoke first, his voice hard. "It is a trap, obviously. We go in there and he kills everyone." Brennan shook her head. "If he wanted them dead, they would already be dead. He is serious about this confrontation. It is personal for him. So what? We just give him what he wants? Walk the colonel into a firing squad?" David found his voice, surprised by how steady it sounded. "He is giving us an opening. By making it personal, by focusing on me, he is telling us his priority. That creates vulnerabilities." Patterson looked at him skeptically. "What kind of vulnerabilities?" "The kind that come from wanting something too badly. Markov wants to humiliate me, to prove I am weak. That means he will keep me alive long enough to stage whatever he has planned. That gives you time to position your team, to wait for the moment when his attention is all on me." Rachel stepped forward. "My father is right. This is not about the hostages. It is about settling a debt. Markov is operating on a warrior's code. That code has rules, patterns. We can use that." Patterson looked between them, father and daughter, both arguing to walk into the trap, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite trust, but something approaching respect. "All right, we go in as planned, but I am adding one element. When Colonel Morgan presents himself to Markov, I want eyes on the entire compound. I want shooters in position. And the second we have confirmation of hostage location, we hit them with everything we have." He turned to David. "Can you keep Markov talking? Keep him focused on you long enough for us to get into position?" David thought about it, about facing the man who had spent 3 decades hunting him, about standing before an enemy who wanted nothing more than to watch him suffer. "I can keep him talking." Brennan stood up, her decision made. "Mission is go. Transport leaves in 18 hours. Use the time to prepare. Mentally, physically, spiritually, however you do it. Because in 24 hours, we are going to find out if ghosts can die twice. The room emptied again, warriors scattering to their preparations. David and Rachel walked out into the morning sun, and the world seemed sharper somehow, colors brighter, sounds clearer. The way things always look before combat, when the brain knew that any moment might be your last and decided to pay attention. Hawk, David said quietly, when we get there, when things go bad, and they will go bad, you do what you have to do. You do not hesitate because of me. Understood? Rachel stopped walking and turned to face him, her green eyes fierce. Do not ask me to choose between the mission and you, Dad. Do not put that on me. I am not asking, I am ordering. As your father and as your commanding officer, you take the shots that need to be taken. Rachel's jaw clenched, and for a moment she looked like she might argue. Then she nodded once, sharp and final. Yes, sir. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Rachel stripped and cleaned her rifle 3 times, checked and rechecked her gear, ran through mental scenarios. David reviewed maps, studied satellite imagery, tried to think like Viktor Markov, to anticipate what the old Russian had planned. As evening fell, they sat together one last time before deployment, eating a quiet meal in the dining facility. Around them, soldiers laughed and talked, normal life continuing, because for them, this was just another day. But for David and Rachel, this might be the last normal meal they ever shared. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. Tell me about Mom. David looked up, surprised. They did not talk about Grace often. It was too painful, even after 27 years. Why now? Because if I died tomorrow, I want to know more about where I came from, about the woman I never got to meet. David set down his fork, his hands shaking, and thought about his wife, about Grace, who had been so strong and so brave, and who had died bringing Rachel into the world, bleeding out in a hospital while doctors fought to save her and failed. Your mother was the strongest person I ever knew. She was a nurse. We met in '94 after I came back from the Gulf. I was a mess. Nightmares, anger, all the things they call PTSD now, but back then we just called being broken. She saw past all that. She saw who I could be if someone believed in me. He paused, lost in memory. She wanted children so badly. We tried for 5 years before you finally came along. And when the doctors said the pregnancy was high risk, that she should terminate, she refused. She said some things are worth dying for. And then she proved it. Rachel's eyes were bright with tears. Do you hate me? For what it cost. David reached across the table and took his daughter's hand, holding it steady despite the tremor. I have never hated you, not for 1 second. You are the best thing I ever did, Hawk. You are Grace's legacy and mine. And tomorrow when we face Viktor Markov, you remember that. You are not just Rachel Morgan. You are the daughter of Grace and David Morgan. You are 3 generations of warriors. And you are loved. They sat together, hands clasped, while around them the dining facility buzzed with life, and outside the sun set on what might be their last day of peace. And somewhere in Montana, an old enemy waited with the patience of a lifetime and the cold certainty of revenge. The deployment clock was ticking, and there was no stopping it now. The helicopter cut through darkness like a blade through water, its rotors beating a rhythm that David Morgan felt in his chest more than heard. He sat strapped into the jump seat, surrounded by 8 Navy SEALs who looked like they had been carved from granite and painted in shades of night. They wore their gear with the casual ease of men who had done this 1,000 times before. Weapons held with the kind of familiarity that came from knowing your rifle better than you knew your own family. Rachel sat across from him, her face painted in greens and blacks, her M2010 rifle held vertical between her knees. In the red light of the helicopter's interior, she looked like a stranger. Not his daughter, not the little girl who used to sit on his lap and ask him to tell stories about the stars. She looked like what she was, a weapon. A tool designed for the single purpose of delivering death at distance with mathematical precision. David wondered when exactly that transformation had become complete. When had she stopped being his child and become this? And whose fault was it? His, for training her? Hers, for exceeding every lesson he ever taught? Or was it just the nature of war itself, the way it took soft things and made them hard, took innocence and replaced it with the cold certainty of violence? Lieutenant Colonel Patterson sat at the front of the helicopter, studying a tablet that showed live satellite imagery of their target area. He had not said much since they boarded at Fort Campbell 3 hours ago. Professional silence. The kind warriors maintained before combat because words were a luxury and concentration was survival. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, barely audible over the rotor noise. 5 minutes to drop zone. Weather is holding, but wind is picking up. Gonna be a rough insertion. Patterson keyed his mic. Copy. Team, final equipment check. We hit the ground running. The SEALs moved in synchronized silence, checking weapons, adjusting gear, the ritual dance of men preparing to step into the unknown. David watched them with the practiced eye of someone who had done this same dance in jungles a lifetime ago. They were good, very good. But Victor Constantine was not some random insurgent. He was a professional who had spent 50 years preparing for this exact moment. And David was about to walk his daughter directly into the spider's web. Rachel caught his eye across the helicopter's interior and gave him a small nod. Not reassurance, just acknowledgement. They were in this together, whatever came next. That was the deal they had made without words, the unspoken contract between warriors who happened to share blood. The helicopter began to descend, the change in altitude making David's ears pop. Through the open door, he could see mountains rising like teeth against the star-filled sky, the Bitterroot Range stretching endlessly in every direction. Beautiful and deadly, the way mountains always were, indifferent to human concerns, to the small dramas of violence and revenge that played out on their slopes. They landed hard in a clearing, barely large enough for the helicopter's rotors, trees pressing in on all sides. The moment the skids touched Earth, the SEALs were moving, flowing out of the helicopter like water, taking up defensive positions in a perimeter that formed so quickly it seemed choreographed. David climbed out more slowly, his legs protesting, his hands gripping the helicopter's frame to steady himself. Rachel was beside him instantly, her hand on his elbow, supporting without making it obvious. They moved away from the landing zone and the helicopter lifted off immediately, its rotor wash bending trees and kicking up pine needles. Then it was gone, climbing into the night sky, and the sudden silence was absolute. Just wind moving through trees and the sound of 8 men breathing in controlled rhythm. Patterson materialized beside David and Rachel like a ghost, his face paint making him look like something from a nightmare. We move in 5. Radio silence from here on unless contact. You two stay with me until we reach the overwatch position. Clear? Clear, Rachel whispered. David just nodded. His throat was tight, his heart beating faster than it should. Not fear exactly, something else. Recognition that this was it. 52 years of waiting, of looking over his shoulder, of wondering when Victor Constantine would finally come for him. And now the waiting was over. They moved through the forest in tactical formation. SEALs spread out in a pattern that gave them overlapping fields of fire while minimizing their profile. David and Rachel stayed in the middle, the old warrior and the young one, separated by decades but bound by blood and training, and the particular understanding that came from both having looked through a rifle scope at another human being and made the decision to end that life. The terrain was brutal, steep slopes covered in loose rock, fallen trees creating obstacles that had to be climbed over or crawled under, elevation that made breathing difficult even for men in peak physical condition. David felt every one of his 68 years, his legs burning, his lungs working too hard, his hands shaking even worse than usual from the cold and the exertion. But he kept moving, kept putting one foot in front of the other, because stopping was not an option, because Victor Constantine was waiting, because his daughter was here and he could not show weakness in front of her. They walked for 3 hours. 3 hours of silent, exhausting progress through mountain wilderness that had probably not seen a human being in months. Above them, stars wheeled slowly across the sky, indifferent and eternal. Below them, somewhere in a valley they could not yet see, Victor Constantine waited with 40 armed men and 3 hostages in a vendetta that had aged like fine wine, growing stronger with every passing year. Finally, Patterson raised his fist, the universal signal to halt. The team froze, melting into the landscape like they had never existed. David and Rachel crouched behind a fallen tree, breathing hard, and waited. Patterson moved forward alone, scouting, then returned and gestured them forward. They crept to the edge of a ridge and looked down into the valley below, and there it was. The compound. From satellite imagery, it had looked like any abandoned mining operation. A cluster of buildings, some corrugated metal structures, a few larger warehouse-type constructions. But from here, with moonlight painting everything in silver and shadow, David could see the truth of it. This was no random militia hideout. This was a fortress. The buildings were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Guard towers had been erected at strategic points, giving whoever manned them line of sight on all approaches. Spotlights swept the perimeter in predictable patterns, and David counted at least 12 armed guards visible, even at this late hour. The compound was surrounded by open ground, probably cleared deliberately, creating a kill zone that anyone approaching would have to cross. And in the center of it all, the largest building, probably the old mines processing facility, sat dark and silent. That was where the hostages would be. That was where Victor Constantine would be waiting. Patterson pulled out a tablet and began marking positions, building a tactical picture of the compound's defenses. David studied the layout with 50 years of experience reading terrain and threat, and his stomach sank. This was not the work of weekend warriors playing soldier. This was professional, military-grade defensive positioning. Victor had built himself a fortress and then baited the trap with American lives. The SEAL commander looked at David, his expression unreadable behind the face paint. Your assessment? David kept his voice barely above a whisper. He has had months to prepare this. Every approach is covered. He will have fallback positions inside the buildings, probably booby traps, definitely interlocking fields of fire. A frontal assault would be suicide. Patterson nodded slowly. Agreed, which is why we are not doing a frontal assault. You and your daughter set up here. This ridge gives you line of sight on the entire compound at approximately 800 meters. Good shooting distance for a rifle like hers. He pointed to a cluster of buildings on the western edge of the compound. Intel suggests the hostages are being held there. That warehouse with the red roof. My team will infiltrate from the east while you provide overwatch. When we have the hostages secured, we exfil fast and hard. But if things go wrong, if we get pinned down, I need you to be our guardian angel. Can you do that? Rachel answered before David could. We can do that, sir. Patterson looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you can. We move in 2 hours. Use the time to get set up, to range your targets, to get your breathing under control. And Sergeant Morgan, Sergeant. Sir, if you see Victor Constantine, you do not take the shot without my authorization. He is a high-value target, but he is also our best leverage if negotiations become necessary. Clear? Rachel's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Clear, sir. Patterson melted back into the darkness, taking his team with him. And suddenly David and Rachel were alone on the ridge, looking down at a compound full of enemies and the ghosts of decisions made half a century ago. Rachel immediately went to work, transforming from person to machine with a speed that still startled David even after years of watching her do it. She found a position behind a cluster of rocks that gave her a stable platform and natural concealment, tested the angle, adjusted slightly, tested again. Then she unpacked her rifle, assembled it with movements so practiced they seemed automatic, and settled into a prone position that would have looked uncomfortable to anyone who did not understand that comfort was irrelevant when you were a sniper. David lowered himself beside her, his body screaming at the abuse, and pulled out his spotting scope. His hands shook as he tried to hold it steady, and he had to brace his elbows against a rock to compensate. Through the scope, the compound jumped into sharp focus, and he began the slow process of mapping it in his mind. Guard positions, patrol routes, blind spots, danger areas. Rachel's voice was barely a breath beside him. Wind? David licked his finger and held it up, feeling the air movement. Then he checked the small weather station she had set up, reading temperature and barometric pressure. Wind is variable, 3 to 5 miles per hour coming from the north-northwest. Temperature is 38 degrees and dropping. Pressure is steady. You will need to adjust for cold bore on your first shot. Rachel made minute adjustments to her scope, dialing in the data, building a mental picture of how her bullets would fly through this particular piece of air on this particular night. This was the art of it, the part that separated good snipers from legendary ones. Understanding that every shot was unique, that wind and temperature and humidity and 1,000 other factors all combined to create a specific equation that had to be solved in the moment. They lay together in silence, father and daughter, watching the compound below through glass and mathematics. Guards changed position, lights swept predictable patterns. Somewhere, men who thought they were safe went about their business, unaware that death was studying them from 800 meters away, calculating, measuring, waiting. After an hour, David spotted movement that made his breath catch. A figure emerged from the central building, tall and straight despite his age, white hair visible even in the poor light. The figure walked slowly around the compound perimeter, stopping occasionally to speak with guards, and there was something about the way he moved, the confidence, the absolute certainty of someone who owned the space around him. Victor Constantine. Rachel saw him too, her body tensing slightly. That is him? That is him, David confirmed, his voice rough. I have the shot. 820 meters. No wind, clear line. I could end this right now. David's hand moved to her shoulder, gentle but firm. No. Patterson's orders. And besides, if you shoot him now, his men will execute the hostages before the SEALs can reach them. We play this patient. Rachel's finger moved away from the trigger, but David could feel the tension in her body, the predator's instinct to strike when prey was vulnerable. She was a better soldier than that, though. She knew when to shoot and when to wait, and waiting was often harder. Victor completed his circuit of the compound and disappeared back into the central building. David exhaled slowly, realizing he had been holding his breath. 52 years, 5 decades of wondering what he would feel when he finally saw Victor Constantine again. And what he felt was not hatred or fear or even curiosity. What he felt was tired. So tired. Tired of carrying this weight. Tired of looking over his shoulder. Tired of being defined by a single trigger pull in a jungle in 1971. But tired did not matter. Only the mission mattered. Only getting Rachel out of this alive mattered. Time crawled forward with the particular slowness that came before combat. Minutes felt like hours, and every sound was magnified. Every movement potentially hostile. David watched through his spotting scope until his eye ached, mapping the compound until he could have drawn it from memory, until he knew every guard's pattern, every blind spot, every potential line of fire. Rachel lay beside him, barely breathing, her body so still she might have been carved from stone. This was her natural state, he realized. This was where she was most herself. Not in the cabin in Tennessee, not at family dinners that never happened, not in any normal life. Here, on a ridge in the darkness, with a rifle in her hands and enemies in her sights. He had made her into this, and he could not decide if that was a gift or a curse. Patterson's voice crackled softly in their earpieces, the first radio transmission in hours. Overwatch, this is actual. We are in position. Beginning infiltration in 5 minutes. Report any changes in compound status. Rachel keyed her mic, her voice barely audible. Overwatch copies. Compound shows normal activity. 12 visible sentries, 2 in towers, remainder on foot patrol. Target building appears secured but not heavily guarded. No indication they are expecting contact. Good. Maintain observation. If things go hot, you know what to do. Understood, sir. The radio went silent again. David checked his watch. 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, 8 Navy SEALs would begin moving toward that compound, threading through defenses that had been designed specifically to kill them, trying to reach 3 hostages before Victor Constantine decided to execute them as an object lesson in patience. And David and Rachel would watch it all through glass, 800 meters away, able to see everything but change nothing unless shooting became necessary. God, David hated being old. Hated that his hands shook too much to trust his own rifle. Hated that he was relegated to spotter instead of shooter. Hated that he had to watch his daughter carry the weight that used to be his burden alone. But hating changed nothing. Age came for everyone eventually, even warriors, and the only choice was how you faced it. With dignity or with denial. David had chosen dignity, even though it burned. Movement below. The SEAL team barely visible even when you knew where to look, flowing through the darkness like smoke. They reached the perimeter of the cleared ground around the compound and stopped, waiting for the searchlight pattern to create a gap. David held his breath. This was the moment, the crossing, the point where they went from hunters to hunted. The searchlight swept past, and the SEALs moved, covering the open ground in seconds, reaching the cover of the compound's outer buildings without triggering any alarms. Professional. Perfect. Exactly what elite operators were supposed to look like. Patterson's voice, calm as death. Phase 1 complete, moving to target building. Rachel tracked them through her scope, her breathing so controlled it barely moved her body. David watched through the spotting scope, his own breathing less controlled, his heart rate elevated. 50 years since he had done this for real, but the feeling was the same. The hyper-awareness, the sense that time had slowed down and sped up simultaneously. The knowledge that in the next few minutes people would probably die, and some of them might be people you cared about. The SEALs reached the warehouse with the red roof, stacked up beside the door in tactical formation. Patterson tried the handle. Locked. One of his men pulled out a small explosive charge, placed it carefully, and everyone stepped back. The charge blew with a sound that echoed across the valley like thunder, and suddenly everything went to hell. Alarms screamed. Lights flooded the compound bright as day. Guards poured out of buildings, running toward the warehouse, weapons raised, and from the central building, Victor Constantine emerged, moving fast for a man his age, shouting orders in Russian. Rachel's voice was ice calm. We have approximately 40 hostiles responding to the breach. SEAL team is about to be surrounded. Patterson's voice tight but controlled. Overwatch, we have the hostages, but they are in bad shape. Need time to get them mobile. Can you buy us 30 seconds? Rachel did not hesitate. Consider it bought. Her first shot broke the night. The suppressed rifle coughed, a sound more like a heavy cough than a gunshot, and 800 meters away, a guard running toward the warehouse dropped like someone had cut his strings. Perfect headshot. He was dead before he knew danger existed. Her second shot, 3 seconds later. Another guard down, then a third, a fourth. Rachel worked with mechanical precision, identifying threats, prioritizing targets, eliminating them with shots that would have been difficult in daylight from a stable position. She was making them in darkness, with stress hormones flooding her system, with her father's trembling hands beside her, adjusting the spotting scope to call the next target. David fell into the rhythm they had practiced 1,000 times. Call the wind, call the distance, watch for impact, adjust for the next shot. His voice steady despite the chaos, despite watching his daughter kill men with the same cold efficiency he had once possessed. Next target, left tower, 70 meters left of your last impact. Distance 815 meters, wind negligible. Rachel shifted, acquired, fired. The tower guard dropped. Good kill. New target, compound center, running towards SEAL position. Distance 800 meters even. Wind 2 miles per hour left to right. Shift, acquire, fire. Another guard fell. They worked together like a machine, each shot buying Patterson's team precious seconds to get the hostages mobile, to prepare for extraction. Rachel's rifle spoke in whispers and men died, and through the spotting scope, David watched Victor Constantine realize what was happening. Watched the old Russian's head snap toward the ridge where they were positioned. Watched him point and shout. Watched him understand. The sniper who killed Ivan Petrov was here, on that ridge, watching. Victor pulled a radio from his belt and began giving orders, and David saw the compound's response shift. Guards stopped running noisily toward the SEAL team and began taking cover, began looking up at the ridge, began preparing to return fire. Rachel, they have spotted our position. We need to relocate. 30 more seconds. Patterson needs 30 more seconds. Rachel kept shooting. A guard trying to flank the SEAL team, another attempting to set up a machine gun position, a third moving with too much purpose toward what looked like a communications building. Each shot was perfect, professional, necessary. But the return fire was starting now, bullets impacting the rocks around them, kicking up stone chips and dirt. One round passed close enough that David heard it crack through the air beside his head. In another moment, he was 19 years old again in Vietnam, hugging the earth while enemy fire tried to find him. Young and terrified, and realizing for the first time that he was not immortal. But he was not 19 anymore. He was 68, and his daughter was beside him, and she needed him to do his job. Adjustment? Wind picking up. 4 miles per hour now. Call it left. Rachel adjusted, fired, and the guard who had been drawing a bead on their position dropped. She had seen the threat to them and eliminated it without David even having to call it. That was instinct. That was the mark of a truly gifted sniper. Patterson's voice crackled through the radio, strained but functional. Overwatch, we have the packages and we are moving to exfil point. Compound is fully alert. You need to pull back now. Rachel fired one more shot, eliminating a guard who was trying to pursue the SEAL team, then began breaking down her rifle with movements so fast they blurred. David collapsed his spotting scope, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. They scrambled backward from their position as more fire began to concentrate on the ridge, bullets chewing through the space they had occupied seconds before. They moved through the forest in a controlled retreat, Rachel half carrying David when his legs threatened to give out. Both of them running on adrenaline and training and the absolute necessity of surviving the next 5 minutes. Behind them, the compound was chaos, lights and shouting, and the sound of engines starting as Victor's men mobilized to pursue. They reached the extraction point just as the helicopters came in low and fast, rotors beating the air into submission. The SEAL team was already there, loading 3 battered but alive hostages into the first helicopter. Patterson saw David and Rachel and gestured frantically. Move, move, move! They ran, David's lungs burning, his vision starting to gray at the edges. Rachel's hand was on his arm, pulling him forward, and then they were at the helicopter, hands reaching down to haul them aboard. David collapsed into a jump seat, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs hard enough to hurt. Rachel landed beside him, already checking her rifle, making sure no damage had occurred during the retreat. The helicopter lifted off, and through the open door, David could see the compound falling away below them. Could see guards running out of buildings, pointing up at the escaping helicopters. Could see Victor Constantine standing in the center of it all, alone and still, looking up at the skyline. Looking directly at David, even though there was no way he could see into the helicopter from that distance. But David felt it anyway. Felt Victor's gaze like a physical thing. Felt the old Russian's rage and frustration and the absolute certainty that this was not over. Could not be over. Would never be over until one of them was dead. Patterson dropped into the seat beside them, pulling off his helmet, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. That was some damn fine shooting, Sergeant Morgan. You kept my men alive, all 3 hostages secured, 0 friendly casualties. Mission success. Rachel nodded, her face neutral, but David could see the tremor starting in her hands now that the action was over. Post-adrenaline shakes. He had seen it 1,000 times, had experienced it himself more times than he could count. The body's way of burning off stress hormones, of coming down from the edge. Patterson looked at David and something in his expression had changed. Not quite respect, but maybe the beginning of it. Your daughter is the real deal, Colonel. I doubted that. I was wrong. She is one of the best I have ever seen operate under pressure. David wanted to feel pride, wanted to feel vindication that his daughter had proven herself to these elite warriors. But all he felt was exhausted and old and aware that they had won this battle, but the war was far from over. We did not get Constantine, David said quietly. Patterson's expression hardened. No, he slipped away in the chaos. By the time we secured the hostages, he was gone. Probably had an escape route planned from the beginning. Of course he did, David said. Victor always has an escape route. He has been doing this for 50 years. He does not make mistakes. So what now? Now, David said, looking out the helicopter door at the mountains falling away below. He comes after us. Not next week, not next month, soon. Because this was not about the hostages. This was about me. And I just embarrassed him in front of his men. I made him look weak. That is something Victor Constantine cannot tolerate. Rachel spoke up, her voice steady despite the shake in her hands. Then let him come. Next time we will be ready. David looked at his daughter, this fierce warrior who refused to back down, who had just saved 8 men and 3 hostages with shooting that bordered on miraculous. And he felt his heart clench with love and fear in equal measure. Because he knew something she did not know yet, something that came from 50 years of experience and intimate understanding of how men like Victor Constantine thought. This was not over. This was just beginning. And before it ended, before this 52-year-old debt was finally paid, someone he loved was going to bleed. The helicopter flew through the night, carrying them away from the Bitterroot Mountains, away from Victor Constantine's compound, away from the immediate danger. But David could feel it following them like a shadow, like a ghost that would not rest until the bill came due. He looked at Rachel, memorizing her face in the red light of the helicopter's interior, and he thought about Grace, his wife, who had died bringing this woman into the world. Thought about all the choices that had led to this moment, all the triggers pulled and missions completed and wars fought. And he wondered if it had been worth it. If training his daughter to be a warrior instead of letting her be just a woman had been the right choice or the most terrible mistake he had ever made. But the answer did not matter now. The choice was made. The die was cast. And all they could do was see it through to whatever end awaited them. The helicopter cut through darkness, carrying warriors home from a battle won, while behind them, in a compound full of dead men and failed plans, An old enemy nursed his rage and prepared for the next round. Because this was what warriors did. They fought until they could not fight anymore. And sometimes, David thought, looking at his daughter, they fought even after that. The debriefing room at Fort Campbell felt smaller than it had 3 days ago. The walls closer, the air thicker with something David Morgan could not quite name. Success, maybe. Or the particular weight that came after violence when the adrenaline faded and you were left with the memory of what you had done and the understanding that those memories would never fully leave. Colonel Sarah Brennan stood at the front of the room, her expression neutral, but her eyes showing satisfaction. 3 former CIA officers sat to her left, bandaged and exhausted, but alive. The SEAL team occupied the chairs behind David and Rachel, their presence a solid wall of professional competence. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson sat directly behind Rachel, and David could feel the shift in the man's attitude. The way he now looked at Rachel was something approaching respect instead of skepticism. Brennan's voice cut through the quiet. Mission accomplished. 3 American lives saved. 0 friendly casualties. 11 confirmed enemy killed. Compound neutralized as a threat. The Free Mountain Patriots militia has scattered. Viktor Markov is in the wind, but we have his associates under surveillance. This was a significant operational success. She paused and her gaze moved to Rachel. Staff Sergeant Morgan, your performance under fire was exceptional. 8 confirmed kills at extended range, under stress conditions, with hostile fire incoming. Your shooting bought the assault team the time they needed to secure the hostages and extract safely. I am recommending you for a Bronze Star with Valor device. Rachel's face remained neutral, but David saw her hands tighten slightly on her knees. Thank you, ma'am. I was just doing my job. Brennan allowed herself a small smile. Your job, Sergeant, is what separates living Americans from dead ones. Do not minimize it. She turned to David. Colonel Morgan, your tactical assessment of the compound's defenses was accurate and invaluable. Your presence as spotter enabled your daughter to operate at maximum effectiveness. The United States Army thanks you for your continued service. David nodded, accepting the words but feeling their emptiness. They had won the battle. Yes. Saved the hostages? Yes. But Viktor Markov was still out there, still breathing, still planning. And men like Viktor did not accept humiliation quietly. One of the rescued CIA officers, a man in his late 50s, with a face that had seen too much and forgotten nothing, raised his hand. Colonel Brennan, if I may? Go ahead, Mr. Reeves. The man stood slowly, his movements careful from injuries sustained during captivity. He turned to face David and Rachel. I want to thank you both personally. Markov told us we were dead, that our government would not risk a rescue operation, that we would die in that compound and no one would ever know what happened to us. You proved him wrong. You came for us. And I will remember that for the rest of my life. His voice caught slightly, emotion breaking through the professional mask. So thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. David felt something twist in his chest. This was why they did it. Not for medals or recognition or the abstract concept of service. For moments like this. For looking into the eyes of someone who would have died and seeing them alive because you had been willing to walk into darkness. Rachel spoke quietly. We do not leave Americans behind, sir. That is the promise. Reeves nodded and sat back down. And the room was silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of what had been said and what it meant. Brennan cleared her throat. Dismissed. Colonel Morgan, Staff Sergeant Morgan, please remain. The room emptied, leaving just the 3 of them. Brennan waited until the door closed. Then her expression shifted from professional satisfaction to something harder, more concerned. We have a problem. David's stomach tightened. He had been expecting this. Markov sent a message, through back channels, untraceable, but definitely from him. It arrived 4 hours ago. She pulled out a tablet and turned it so David and Rachel could see the screen. It showed a photograph, obviously taken with a telephoto lens, of David's cabin in Tennessee, the place where he had lived for 30 years, where he had raised his daughter, where he had tried to build a life separate from war. And standing in the driveway, clear as day, was a figure in tactical gear holding a rifle. One of Viktor's men had been there, at David's home, while they were in Montana. The message that came with the photo was simple. 3 words in Russian that David did not need translated because he knew what they would say before Brennan spoke. Nowhere is safe. Rachel's voice was tight, controlled anger barely leashed. He went to our home. Not just went there, Brennan said. He had men watching it. This photo was taken 36 hours ago while you were in Montana. He was demonstrating that he knows where you live, that he can reach you anytime he wants, and that your success in Montana means nothing in the larger game. David stared at the photograph, at his cabin, at the place that represented peace and normalcy and everything he had fought to preserve. Violated, marked, turned into just another battlefield in a war that would not end. "What is our protection status?" Rachel asked. Brennan's expression was apologetic. "We can offer protective custody, safe houses, rotating locations, armed guards. But you understand the limitations. We cannot provide that level of security indefinitely. Eventually, you would need to return to normal life, and Victor would be waiting." "So what are you suggesting?" David asked, though he already knew the answer. Brennan met his eyes. "We are suggesting that you let us bring Victor in. We have assets tracking his known associates, monitoring his communications. We believe we can locate him within the next few weeks. When we do, we can either eliminate him as a threat or bring him in for trial on terrorism charges related to the hostage situation." David shook his head slowly. "You will not find him. Victor has been evading intelligence services for decades. He has survived multiple manhunts, multiple wars. He stays invisible because he is better at it than you are at looking." "Then what do you propose?" David looked at his daughter, seeing the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw was set. He thought about Grace, about the woman who had died bringing Rachel into the world, about the promise he had made to raise their daughter right, to protect her, to give her a life worth living. And he thought about Viktor Markov standing in his compound, looking up at the helicopter carrying David away, nursing his humiliation and his rage and his 33-year-old vendetta. There was only one way this ended, only one way it had ever been going to end. "I draw him out," David said quietly. "I give him what he wants. Me." "Absolutely not," Rachel said immediately. "Dad, that is exactly what he wants. That is suicide." "Is it? Or is it the only way to end this? Victor will never stop hunting us. He will wait years if he has to, decades if necessary. He has already proven that. So we can spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, or we can finish it." Brennan leaned forward. "Colonel Morgan, if you are suggesting what I think you are suggesting, I cannot authorize it. Using yourself as bait for an unsanctioned operation against a foreign national would create significant legal and diplomatic complications." David smiled without humor. "Then do not authorize it, Colonel. I am a retired civilian with Parkinson's disease. What I do on my own time is my business. And if I happen to return to my home in Tennessee and spend some time on my porch with a rifle in my lap, well, that is just an old man enjoying his property rights." Rachel grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "Dad, listen to yourself. You can barely hold a rifle steady. Your hands shake so badly you cannot make the shots anymore. If Victor comes for you, you will die." "Maybe," David said, "or maybe I will take him with me. Either way it ends. And you get to live your life without this hanging over you." "I do not want a life without you in it." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest, and David saw tears in his daughter's eyes for the first time since she was a child. Rachel, who had killed 8 men 3 days ago without hesitation, who could maintain operational calm under hostile fire, who was one of the best snipers in the United States Army, was crying. For him. Because of him. David reached up and took her hand, his own trembling against her steady grip. "Hawk, I am 68 years old. I have Parkinson's disease. Every day I wake up weaker than the day before. Every day my hands shake a little more. I am dying by degrees, becoming less of who I was with every sunrise. That is just reality. I accepted it years ago." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I can still choose how the story ends. I can die in a nursing home, unable to feed myself, unable to recognize you, a shell of the man I was. Or I can die as a warrior, facing my enemy, protecting the person I love most in this world. That is not suicide, Hawk. That is choosing dignity over decay." Brennan stood up. "I need to make some calls. Colonel Morgan, you are officially on medical leave as of this moment, returning to your home for rest and recovery. What happens after that is beyond my jurisdiction. But understand this, if you get yourself killed, I will be very disappointed. And if you survive this and need support, you call me. Immediately. Clear?" "Clear, ma'am." Brennan looked at Rachel. "Take care of your father, Sergeant. And remember, sometimes the hardest part of being a warrior is knowing when to fight and when to walk away." She left, and David and Rachel sat alone in the debriefing room, the photograph of the violated cabin still glowing on the abandoned tablet. "I am coming with you," Rachel said finally. Not a question, a statement of fact. No, yes, you do not get to make this decision alone. You do not get to sacrifice yourself without me having a say. David turned to face her fully. Rachel, listen to me. If you are there, Victor will use you against me. He will threaten you, hurt you, force me to watch. That is who he is. That is what this is about. But if you are somewhere else, somewhere safe, then it is just him and me. Old warriors settling old debts. Clean, simple. There is nothing clean or simple about watching you die. Maybe not, but it is necessary. Victor wants me, not you, and I will not give him the satisfaction of making you a victim in this. Rachel stood up, her face hard, and for a moment David saw himself in her. Saw the stubborn refusal to back down, the absolute certainty that she was right. It was like looking in a mirror that showed him who he used to be before age and disease had made him slow. You do not get to do this, she said. You do not get to be the hero who sacrifices himself so everyone else can live happily ever after. That is not how this works. Then how does it work, Hawk? Tell me. Because from where I sit, I see a man who is dying anyway and an enemy who will never stop hunting my daughter. So I can die slow and useless, or I can die protecting you. Those are my options. Which would you choose? Rachel's face crumpled, the warrior mask breaking, and suddenly she was just his daughter again. Just the little girl who used to sit on his lap and ask him to tell her stories about the stars, about her mother, about why the world was the way it was. I would choose you staying alive, she whispered. David pulled her into a hug, feeling how small she seemed despite her strength, despite everything she had become. I know, baby, I know. But that is not one of the choices. They stayed like that for a long moment, father and daughter, holding on to each other, while the world turned indifferent around them. Then Rachel pulled back, wiped her eyes, and when she spoke again, her voice had regained its steel. Fine. You go back to Tennessee, you set yourself up as bait. But I am watching. From a distance, where Victor cannot see me, but close enough to intervene if things go wrong. And if he kills you, Dad, I swear to God, I will hunt him to the ends of the earth. He will never know peace again, never feel safe again. I will become the ghost he cannot shake. That is my promise. David looked at his daughter and saw the absolute certainty in her eyes. She meant every word. If he died, she would spend the rest of her life hunting Victor Markov, would become exactly what he had trained her to be, a weapon with a singular purpose. Maybe that was justice. Maybe that was what Victor deserved. Or maybe it was just more violence begetting more violence. The cycle that never ended. The war that consumed everything it touched. But David was too tired to argue anymore. Too tired to fight against the inevitable. All right, Hawk, you can watch. But from at least 1,000 meters. Promise me. I promise. They left Fort Campbell the next morning, driving back to Tennessee in David's old pickup truck. The mountains rose around them like old friends welcoming them home. But there was no comfort in the familiar landscape now. Just the knowledge that somewhere out there, Victor Markov was watching, waiting, planning his next move. David spent the drive thinking about Ivan Sokolov, about the young Soviet sniper he had killed in Desert Storm 33 years ago, about the letter in Ivan's pocket, written to a wife who would never receive it, to children who would grow up without a father, about whether that killing had been necessary or just convenient, justified or just another death in a war that had no clear purpose. The truth was, David did not know anymore. Had not known for years. War turned everything gray, made moral certainty impossible. You did what you were ordered to do, what seemed necessary in the moment, and you lived with the consequences. And sometimes those consequences waited 33 years to come due. They reached the cabin in the late afternoon, and David sat in the truck for a long moment, looking at his home. Someone from Victor's network had stood right there in the driveway, had photographed this place, had marked it for death. The violation of it burned in his chest, mixing with anger and sadness and acceptance. This was where it would end, in the place he had built with his own hands, where he had raised his daughter alone, where he had tried to find peace after war. There was a certain symmetry to it, a closing of the circle. Rachel helped him inside, and they went through the motions of normalcy, unpacking, making coffee, checking that nothing had been disturbed. The cabin was exactly as they had left it, but it felt different now, haunted by the knowledge that enemy eyes had seen it, that it was no longer a sanctuary but a battlefield, waiting to become active. That night, David sat on the porch with his Gulf War-era M24 rifle across his lap. His hands shook as he held it, the tremor worse than usual, but he held it anyway. This rifle had taken 178 lives, had ended Ivan Sokolov, had started the chain of events that led to this moment. It seemed fitting that it might take one more life, or lose one. Rachel sat beside him, her own rifle within easy reach, and they watched the forest together as darkness fell. Somewhere out there, beyond the tree line, Rachel had positioned cameras and motion sensors, creating a perimeter that would give them an advance warning of anyone approaching. But they both knew Victor was too smart to trigger obvious alarms. When he came, it would be in a way they did not expect, from an angle they had not covered. That was what made him dangerous. That was what had kept him alive for decades. The days passed with agonizing slowness. Waiting, watching. Every sound potentially hostile, every movement in the forest potentially Victor coming to collect his debt. David's Parkinson's seemed to worsen under the stress, his hands shaking almost constantly now, his legs unsteady. He practiced with the rifle every day, trying to will his body to cooperate, but it was like fighting against the tide. Age was undefeated and disease did not negotiate. Rachel spent hours in the forest, setting up observation posts, creating firing positions, mapping every approach to the cabin. She was preparing a battlefield, turning the familiar landscape into a killing ground. David watched her work and felt pride and grief in equal measure. She was so good at this, so professional, so completely the weapon he had forged. And he wondered again if he had stolen something from her. Some chance at a normal life, at happiness that did not involve calculating wind speed and bullet trajectories. But it was too late for those questions now. The die was cast, the players were in position, and soon, very soon, the final act would begin. It came on the 7th night. David was on the porch, half asleep despite his best efforts to stay alert, when the satellite phone Rachel had given him buzzed. He picked it up, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. "Dad, you have movement. 300 meters northeast of the cabin. Single individual, moving tactical. This is it." David's heart rate spiked, adrenaline flooding his system despite his exhaustion. He stood up slowly, gripping the rifle, his legs protesting. "Where are you?" "Ridge to the west, 1,200 meters out. I have line of sight on most approaches, but not all. Dad, if this goes bad, if he gets close, you run, you hear me? You do not try to be a hero. You run and I will cover you." David did not respond to that. Instead, he moved to the door of the cabin and called out into the darkness. "Victor Markov, I know you are out there. Come on in. Let us finish this." Silence. Just the wind moving through the pines, the sound of night insects, the beating of his own heart too fast and too hard in his chest. Then a voice from the darkness, accented but clear. "David Morgan, the sand ghost. You know, I have imagined this moment for so many years, dreamed of it, planned for it. And now that it is here, I find I am almost sad, because after tonight the hunt will be over, and I have enjoyed the hunt." "Where are you?" "Everywhere and nowhere. I learned from the best, after all. From Ivan. And from you, in a way. Every report I read about your work in Desert Storm taught me something. Every kill you made showed me how you think. Movement in the tree line, a shadow separating from other shadows." Victor Markov stepped into the clearing around the cabin, and even in the poor light, David could see he had aged but remained formidable. Still straight, still strong, still moving with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He carried a rifle, but it was slung across his back. His hands were empty, held out to his sides. "I am unarmed," he called out. "For now, because I want to talk before we end this. I want you to understand what you took from me." David's finger rested on the trigger, but he did not fire. Some instinct, some understanding of the warrior's code that Victor was invoking, kept him from shooting a man who had come in apparent peace. "I know what I took from you. Ivan Sokolov was a good man." Victor stopped 10 meters from the porch, close enough that David could see his face clearly. The white hair, the lines carved by time and anger, the eyes that held decades of grief and rage. "You do not know," Victor said quietly. "You cannot know. Ivan was not just my comrade. He was my brother in every way that mattered. We grew up together in Moscow, trained together, survived Afghanistan together. When I was wounded in Chechnya, he carried me 15 miles to safety. When my wife died giving birth to my daughter, he helped me raise her. He was the best man I ever knew." Victor's voice cracked slightly. And you killed him for no reason except that old men in Washington and Moscow decided we should fight in a desert neither of us belonged in. You took his future, his children's future. You took everything. David lowered his rifle slightly. Not much, but enough to be a gesture. I am sorry. I know that does not change anything. I know it does not bring him back. But I carried Ivan with me every day since '91. I read the letter in his pocket. I know he loved his family. I know he was more than just an enemy, and I am sorry. Victor stared at him for a long moment, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe? Or recognition that the man he had spent 3 decades hating was not the monster he had built up in his mind. Your apology means nothing, Victor said, but the words lacked conviction. I came here to kill you, David Morgan, to make you suffer the way I have suffered, to take from you what you took from me. Then do it. David set the rifle down against the porch railing, his hands shaking too badly to hold it anymore anyway. I am right here, unarmed, dying already from Parkinson's disease. You want revenge? Take it. But my daughter is not here. She is somewhere safe. This is between you and me, the way it should have been from the beginning. Victor pulled the rifle from his back, a beautiful weapon that David recognized as a custom-built sniper rifle, probably worth more than his entire cabin. He raised it slowly, deliberately, and aimed at David's chest. In the satellite phone still clutched in David's left hand, Rachel's voice was frantic. Dad, no, I have the shot. Let me take the shot. David did not respond. He stood on his porch, looking at Viktor Markov, and waited for the bullet that would end 33 years of guilt and fear and carrying the weight of 178 dead men. Victor's finger moved to the trigger. His breathing steadied. This was it. This was the moment everything had been building toward. And then Victor lowered the rifle. I cannot do it, he said, and his voice was broken. 33 years I have waited, and I cannot do it. Because you are right, David Morgan. We were just soldiers following orders. The war was not our fault. The deaths were not our fault. We were tools used by men who never had to pull the trigger themselves. He dropped the rifle to the ground and sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 67 years. Ivan would not want this. He would not want me to spend my life consumed by revenge. He would tell me to let it go, to find peace, to honor his memory by living well, not by killing out of grief. David lowered himself slowly to sit on the porch steps, his legs giving out. For a moment, the two old warriors sat in the darkness, separated by 10 meters and 33 years, and the ghost of a man they had both known in different ways. What do we do now? David asked quietly. Victor looked up at the sky, at the stars that looked the same whether seen from Iraq or Montana or Moscow. We stop. We let it end here. We both go home and we try to find whatever peace we can in whatever time we have left. Because the war is over, David. It has been over for a long time. We just forgot to stop fighting it. David felt something release in his chest, some tension he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Agreed. They sat together for a while longer. Two old men who had been enemies longer than they had been anything else, finding an unexpected kind of peace in the Tennessee darkness. Finally, Victor stood up, leaving his rifle where it lay. I am sorry for threatening your daughter, for violating your home, for everything. Ivan would have been ashamed of me. He turned and walked back toward the tree line, and David watched him go. This man who had shaped so much of his life without ever having met him before tonight. Victor, David called out. The old Russian stopped and turned back. If you ever need anything, if there is ever a time when an old warrior needs help from another, you know where to find me. Victor nodded once, a gesture that held more meaning than words could convey, and then he was gone into the forest, fading like smoke, and David was alone on his porch with the satellite phone crackling with Rachel's voice demanding to know what had just happened. Dad, talk to me. What is going on? David raised the phone. It is over, Hawk. He is gone. No shots fired. No one died tonight. A long pause, then Rachel's voice, thick with tears and relief and confusion. I do not understand. Neither do I, David admitted, but I think we just witnessed something rare. Two men choosing peace over war, choosing to let the past stay in the past. He looked up at the stars, the same stars Grace had loved, the same stars he used to point out to a young Rachel while telling her stories on nights like this. Come home, Hawk. It is over. Finally, after all these years, it is over. And somewhere in the darkness, walking through a Tennessee forest toward whatever future awaited him, Viktor Markov carried the same thought, the same exhausted relief, the same understanding that sometimes the greatest victory was choosing not to fight. The war was finally done, and the warriors could rest. 6 months passed like water through fingers, each day bleeding into the next with the peculiar speed that time acquired when you knew it was running out. David Morgan sat on his porch in the early morning light, watching the Tennessee mountains emerge from darkness, and felt the weight of those months in his bones. The Parkinson's had accelerated after the confrontation with Viktor Markov, as if his body had been holding itself together through sheer will and had finally given itself permission to fail. His hands shook constantly now, a tremor so pronounced that simple tasks like buttoning a shirt or holding a cup of coffee required concentration and assistance. His legs had grown weaker, forcing him to use a cane most days and a wheelchair on the bad ones. His voice had developed a slight slur, words sometimes escaping him mid-sentence, his sharp mind trapped in a body that was betraying it piece by piece. But he was at peace. That was the strange gift Viktor Markov had given him that night. By choosing not to pull the trigger, by walking away from 33 years of revenge, the old Russian had released David from a burden he had carried so long, he had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. The guilt over Ivan Sokolov had not disappeared entirely. David suspected it never would, but it had transformed from a sharp knife in his chest to something duller, more bearable, a scar instead of an open wound. Rachel's footsteps on the porch boards brought him back to the present. She set a cup of coffee beside him, already knowing he would struggle to hold it himself, and settled into the chair next to his. She wore her army dress uniform, the dark green fabric crisp and perfect, her ribbons and badges catching the morning light. Today was important. Today changed everything. "You ready?" she asked quietly. David looked at his daughter, this woman who had inherited his skills and his burdens and had somehow managed to become something better than he had ever been. "Ready as I will ever be." They had received this call from Colonel Brennan 2 months ago. The Army wanted Rachel as the lead instructor at the Special Operations Sniper School at Fort Benning, Georgia. It was a prestigious assignment, the kind that marked an operator as exceptional, destined for higher rank and greater responsibility. It was everything Rachel had worked for, everything her skills deserved. And it meant leaving Tennessee, leaving the cabin, leaving him. David had insisted she take it, had practically ordered her to accept, pulling rank as both her father and her former commanding officer. Because this was her time, her moment, and he would not let his declining health become the chain that kept her from flying. But God, it was going to be lonely without her. The drive to Fort Campbell took 3 hours, David dozing in the passenger seat while Rachel drove, the mountains giving way to rolling hills and then to the flat expanse of Kentucky. When they arrived, the base was exactly as David remembered it from 6 months ago. But everything felt different now. He was different, weaker, closer to the end. Colonel Brennan met them at the headquarters building, her expression warm but professional. She had aged in the past 6 months too, David noticed. New lines around her eyes, more gray in her hair. Command took its toll on everyone eventually. "Colonel Morgan, Staff Sergeant Morgan, welcome back. We have quite a day planned." She led them through corridors David had walked before, past rooms where young warriors prepared for deployments that would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. They reached a large conference room where Lieutenant Colonel Patterson and his SEAL team waited, along with the 3 rescued CIA officers and a cluster of senior officers David recognized from their rank insignia even if he did not know their names. Patterson stood when Rachel entered, and David saw respect in the SEAL commander's eyes. Real respect, earned respect. Not the skepticism that had been there 6 months ago. "Sergeant Morgan, good to see you again." "You too, sir." Brennan moved to the front of the room and everyone settled into seats. David sat carefully, his legs protesting, Rachel beside him with a hand on his arm, ready to steady him if needed. Brennan began speaking, and David tried to focus despite the fatigue that seemed to be his constant companion now. "We are here today to recognize exceptional service and to discuss the future. Staff Sergeant Rachel Morgan, your performance during Operation Iron Ridge, as we have designated the Montana hostage rescue, was exemplary. 8 confirmed kills under hostile fire, providing overwatch that enabled SEAL Team 3 to complete their mission with 0 friendly casualties. Your shooting was textbook perfect, but more importantly, your tactical judgment and calm under pressure marked you as an operator of the highest caliber." She paused, and David felt pride swell in his chest despite the weariness. It is my honor to inform you that your Bronze Star with Valor device has been approved and will be presented at a ceremony at the Pentagon next month. Additionally, you are being assigned as the lead instructor for precision marksmanship at the Special Operations Sniper School, effective immediately. This is a position typically held by operators with 10 or more years of experience. You are 27 years old. That should tell you how highly your skills are valued. Rachel's voice was steady, professional. Thank you, ma'am. I am honored. Brennan turned to David. Colonel Morgan, your contributions to this operation were equally vital. Your tactical assessment of the compound, your work as spotter for your daughter, and your courage in offering yourself as bait to draw out Victor Markov all exemplify the kind of selfless service that defines the warrior ethos. While your medical retirement precludes active duty status, the Army recognizes your continued dedication to protecting American lives. She picked up a wooden case from the table and opened it, revealing a medal David had not expected to see. It is my privilege to present you with the Distinguished Service Cross for your actions during Operation Iron Ridge and for a career spanning decades of exceptional service to this nation. The room stood, and David felt Rachel help him to his feet, his legs unsteady but holding. Brennan pinned the medal to his civilian jacket, and the weight of it felt like all the years, all the missions, all the men he had killed and saved and fought beside, compressed into a piece of metal and ribbon that would outlast his deteriorating body. The room applauded, and David stood there feeling old and tired and grateful that he had lived long enough to see his daughter recognized for her excellence, to know that she would continue the tradition, that the legacy would outlive him. After the ceremony, Patterson approached them. Colonel Morgan, Sergeant Morgan, a word. They found a quiet corner, and Patterson's expression was serious but not unkind. I wanted to apologize, Colonel. 6 months ago, I doubted your daughter. I questioned whether she was assigned to my operation because of her skills or because of her family connections. I was wrong, completely, inexcusably wrong. She proved herself under fire in ways that still impress me when I review the operation. He turned to Rachel. You are one of the finest snipers I have had the privilege of working with. The students at Benning are lucky to have you as an instructor. You will make them better warriors, and that will save American lives. Rachel's voice was thick with emotion. Thank you, sir. That means more than you know. Patterson extended his hand to David. And sir, I learned something from watching you and your daughter work together. I learned that experience and youth are not enemies but partners, that the old warriors still have wisdom to share, and the young ones have the strength to carry it forward. My father was a Marine, Gulf War veteran. He died when I was in my 20s, and I spent years wishing I had listened to him more, learned from him more. You have given your daughter something precious. You have given her your knowledge and your time. Do not underestimate the value of that gift. David shook the man's hand, his tremor making the gesture awkward, but Patterson held firm. Thank you, Commander. Take care of your men. Always. The rest of the day passed in a blur of handshakes and congratulations, and the particular exhaustion that came from being a center of attention when all you wanted was to rest. By the time they returned to the truck for the drive home, David was beyond tired. He was wrung out, empty, running on nothing but the last reserves of strength a body could muster before it simply stopped. Rachel drove in silence for the first hour, then spoke quietly. Dad, I do not have to take the instructor position. I can request a different assignment, something closer to home, something that lets me be nearby. David had been expecting this, had prepared his response during the long nights when sleep would not come, and he lay in bed listening to his own breathing and wondering how many more breaths he had left. No, Hawk, you take it. You go to Benning and you teach those young shooters everything I taught you and everything you have learned on your own. You pass it forward. That is what warriors do. We do not hoard knowledge. We share it so the next generation can be better than we were. But you are getting worse. The Parkinson's is accelerating. What if something happens and I am not here? Then something happens and you are not here. Rachel, I am 68 years old with a degenerative disease. Something is going to happen eventually, whether you are here or in Georgia or on the moon. You cannot stop it, and I will not let you sacrifice your career to watch me die by degrees. I love you too much for that. Rachel's hands tightened on the steering wheel, and David saw tears on her cheeks. I am not ready to lose you. I know I'm not ready either. But ready does not matter. It is coming anyway. And when it does, I want to know that you are out there making a difference, teaching young warriors, saving lives through the skills you pass on. That is how I live forever, Hawk. Through you. Through the students you train who train other students. That is legacy. That is what actually matters. They drove the rest of the way in silence, and when they reached the cabin, Rachel helped him inside into his chair, the one that held the shape of his body after 30 years. David sat heavily, his bones aching, and looked around at the place he had built with his own hands, where he had raised his daughter alone, where he had tried to find peace after war. This was home. This was where his story would end, and that felt right. Rachel went to the kitchen to make dinner, and David sat watching the light fade through the windows, turning the mountains from green to gold, to purple, to black. Another day ending, another day survived, another small victory in the war against time that everyone eventually lost. The next few weeks passed in preparation for Rachel's departure. She arranged for a home care nurse to check on David twice a week, for neighbors to bring groceries, for his doctor to make house calls. She was trying to create a safety net, trying to ensure he would not be alone, and David let her do it because it gave her comfort, even though they both knew the net had holes that nothing could patch. The night before she left for Fort Benning, they sat together on the porch one last time. The three rifles still hung above the mantel inside, grandfather's and David's, and the empty space waiting for Rachel's when her time came. 3 generations of Morgans. 3 generations of warriors. "Tell me about the first time you held a rifle," Rachel said. "I know you have told me before, but I want to hear it again." David thought back, reaching through decades of memory to find that moment. "I was 8 years old. My father took me out to the range behind our house in Kentucky. It was a single-shot .22, and I could barely hold it steady. He taught me to breathe, to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it, to respect the weapon and what it could do. I missed the first 10 shots, hit the target on the 11th, and I was hooked. There was something about the precision of it, the discipline, the way it rewarded patience and punished rush. I knew even then that shooting was something I would do for the rest of my life." He paused, remembering. "When I came back from the Gulf, after all those years of using that skill in combat, I almost gave it up, almost sold every rifle I owned and never touched one again. But your mother, Grace, she told me something I never forgot. She said the rifle is just a tool. What matters is the hand that holds it and the heart that guides the hand. She said I could choose to see my skill as a curse or as a gift. And she helped me see it as a gift, a way to protect people, a way to serve something larger than myself." "What would Mom think of me?" Rachel asked quietly. "Of what I have become?" David reached over and took his daughter's hand, his tremor making both their hands shake together. "She would be so proud, Hawk. Jumao offer. Not because you are a sniper, but because you are a good woman who uses her skills to protect the innocent. Because you understand that the rifle is not the point. The point is what you stand between, the wolves and the sheep, as the saying goes. Your mother would see that, would see you, would love who you have become." Rachel leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that as the stars came out. Father and daughter, warrior and warrior, both knowing this might be the last peaceful night they would share for a long time. The next morning, Rachel loaded her truck with everything she needed for Fort Benning. Uniforms, gear, her rifle case with its 3 generations of weapons. David stood on the porch, leaning heavily on his cane, and watched her prepare to leave. When everything was packed, she came back to him and wrapped him in a hug that lasted a long time. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, Hawk. Go teach those shooters. Make me proud." "You have always been proud of me." David smiled. "That is true. So go make me more proud. I want to be insufferable about how amazing my daughter is." Rachel pulled back, wiping her eyes, and David saw the little girl she used to be underneath the warrior she had become. That little girl who used to ask him to tell stories, who had learned to shoot tin cans at age 8, who had chosen to follow him into the life he had lived because she wanted to be like her father. He hoped that had been enough. Hoped he had given her enough love, along with the training, enough tenderness to balance the discipline. Hoped she would remember him not just as the man who taught her to kill, but as the father who had loved her with everything he had. "Call me when you get there," he said. Every day, she promised. She got in her truck, and David watched her drive away until the vehicle disappeared down the mountain road, taking with it the most important part of his life, leaving him alone in the cabin with his memories and his failing body, and the certain knowledge that he would not see many more days like this one. He went inside, moving slowly, and sat in his chair. The afternoon stretched empty before him, and he thought about all the afternoons to come, all the quiet hours of a life winding down. Most people would find it depressing, but David found a strange kind of peace in it. He had lived long enough to see his daughter succeed, had made his peace with old enemies, had faced his mortality, and found he was not as afraid of it as he thought he would be. That was something. That was enough. The weeks turned into months. Rachel called every day, telling him about her students, about the young sniper she was teaching, about how satisfying it was to pass on knowledge and watch others grow. David listened to her voice and felt the distance between them like a physical thing, but he also felt pride. She was doing what she was meant to do, living the life she had chosen, and that made the loneliness bearable. His body continued its slow betrayal. Some days were better than others, but the trend was unmistakable. Downward. The home care nurse, a kind woman named Margaret, came 3 times a week now instead of 2. His doctor had started talking about hospice care, about making him comfortable, about quality of life in the time remaining. David listened and nodded and signed whatever papers needed signing, accepting the inevitable with the same calm he had once used to steady his breathing before a long-range shot. 6 months after Rachel left for Fort Benning, David Morgan sat on his porch on a cold November morning and watched the first snow of the season begin to fall. Fat flakes drifting down through still air, covering the mountains in white, making the world clean and new and beautiful. He had always loved snow. The way it muffled sound created a blanket of peace over everything. Grace had loved it too. She used to say that snow was proof that the world could start over, that covering the old with the new was nature's way of offering second chances. David thought about that as he watched the snow fall, about second chances and endings and the space between them where life actually happened. He thought about his father, who had died young in a farming accident when David was 16, about Grace, who had lived just long enough to see her daughter born before bleeding out in a hospital bed, about all the men he had killed in Desert Storm, especially Ivan Sokolov, who had written a letter to his wife that would never be sent. He thought about Viktor Markov, that old enemy who had become something else in their final meeting. Not quite a friend, but no longer an enemy either. Just another old warrior carrying the weight of choices made in youth, trying to find meaning in the years remaining. David reached into his pocket with shaking hands and pulled out his phone, dialed the number he knew by heart. Rachel answered on the second ring, her voice bright despite the early hour. "Morning, Dad. How are you feeling?" "I am good, Hawk. Really good. Just wanted to hear your voice." They talked for a while about nothing important, about her students, about the weather, about plans for Christmas that they both knew might not happen, but pretended would. When the call ended, David sat holding the phone, feeling the weight of it, the connection to his daughter even across the miles. He was tired, so tired. But it was a good tired, the tired that came from a life fully lived, from battles fought and won and lost, from love given and received. He had been a son, a soldier, a husband, a father. He had killed and protected and taught and learned. He had lived. That was enough. That was more than enough. David closed his eyes, letting the cold November air wash over him, and somewhere in the distance, he heard a hawk cry out, its call echoing off the mountains. He smiled, thinking of his daughter, of the legacy that would continue long after he was gone, of the young warriors she would train who would train others in an unbroken chain stretching into a future he would never see. The snow fell softly, covering the world in white, and David Morgan, the sand ghost, the warrior who had carried 178 lives on his conscience, the father who had loved his daughter with everything he had, simply let go. They found him 3 hours later when Margaret arrived for her shift. He was still in his chair on the porch, covered in a thin blanket of snow, his face peaceful, his hands finally still. The Parkinson's tremor that had plagued him for years had stopped at last. In his lap was a photograph he had been holding, creased and faded with age. Grace on their own way, smiling at the camera, alive and beautiful and full of future. Rachel arrived from Fort Benning that evening, driving through the snow with her emergency leave papers in her pocket and grief sitting heavy in her chest. The cabin looked exactly as she remembered it, but empty now in a way it had never been, even when her father was sleeping. Empty the way places became when the person who made them home was gone. She found the photograph still in his lap, her mother's face looking up at her across the years. And beside it, tucked into his jacket pocket, was a letter, written in her father's shaking hand, the words sometimes hard to read where the tremor had made the pen skip, but the message clear. "My dearest Hawk," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I have gone ahead to wherever it is we go. I am not afraid. I lived well. I loved well. And most importantly, I got to watch you become the woman and warrior you were always meant to be. That is more than most fathers get. That is everything. I need you to know that I have no regrets. Not about Desert Storm, not about the choices I made, not about training you to follow in my footsteps. Every path we walk costs something, but it also gives us something. And what you have given me, Hawk, is a reason to be proud every single day of my life. Pass it forward. Teach those young shooters not just how to aim, but why we aim. Teach them that the rifle is a tool of protection, not aggression. Teach them what your mother taught me, that what matters is not the weapon, but the hand that holds it and the heart that guides the hand. I will be with your mother now, telling her all about you, bragging probably, showing her what an amazing woman our daughter became. We will both be watching over you, Hawk, every day, every shot, every student you train. We will be there. Fly high, fly far, and know that you made this old warrior's life worth living. All my love, always and forever, Dad." Rachel sat on the porch where her father had died, reading and rereading the letter until she had it memorized, until his words became part of her the way his training had become part of her, until she could hear his voice saying them. And she cried. Let herself cry in a way she had not allowed herself to do in years, maybe ever. Cried for the father she had lost, for the mother she had never known, for the weight of legacy and the burden of excellence, and the simple, terrible fact that the people you love do not stay, no matter how much you need them. But when the tears stopped, when the grief settled into something she could carry instead of something that crushed her, Rachel stood up and looked out at the mountains her father had loved, covered now in snow that made them clean and new. She had work to do, students to teach, lives to save through the knowledge she could pass on, legacy to honor not through grief, but through excellence. The funeral was held a week later at the military cemetery in Nashville. Full honors for a warrior who had served his country for decades in war and peace. The honor guard fired their rifles into the cold December air, the shots echoing like the ones David had fired so many times. And Rachel accepted the folded flag with hands that did not shake, with eyes that were dry, with the bearing of a soldier who understood that the mission continued even after the warrior fell. Patterson was there in the SEALs from Team 3, and Colonel Brennan, and the 3 CIA officers David had helped save. They stood in the cold and paid their respects to a man who had lived by a code they all understood, a code that said some things were worth dying for, and protecting others was the highest calling any warrior could answer. But the moment that stayed with Rachel, that she would remember for the rest of her life, came when an old man in a long coat approached her after the ceremony. He was tall and straight despite his age, with white hair and eyes that held decades of grief and understanding. Victor Markov. He did not speak at first, just stood beside her looking at the grave, at the headstone that would mark where David Morgan's body rested. Finally, his voice quiet and accented, he spoke. Your father was a good man, a worthy enemy, and in the end, a teacher of wisdom I had forgotten. That wars can end, that old warriors can choose peace. I am sorry for your loss. Rachel looked at this man who had shaped so much of her father's life, who had carried a grudge for 33 years and had chosen at the last moment to let it go. And she understood something her father had tried to tell her, that enemies were just people on the other side of a line someone else had drawn. And sometimes the bravest thing you could do was erase that line. Thank you for letting him live his last months in peace, for giving him that gift. Victor nodded. He gave me a gift too. He showed me that I had become the thing I hated, a man consumed by revenge, unable to see past old wounds. Ivan would have been disappointed in me. Your father helped me remember who I was before the war made me into something else. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small box. I want you to have this. It belonged to Ivan Sokolov, a compass he carried through every mission. It still points true north. I think your father would appreciate the symbolism. And I think Ivan would want it to stay with warriors who understand what it means to serve. Rachel took the box, felt the weight of it, the history contained in something so small. I will treasure it. Viktor Marakov saluted her, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another, and then he was gone, walking away through the snow-covered cemetery, just another old man carrying the weight of too many years and too many wars, but also carrying the hope that peace was still possible, even for the broken. Rachel stood alone by her father's grave for a long time after everyone else had left. The snow had started falling again, covering the fresh earth, making everything clean and new the way it always did. She thought about the letter in her pocket, about her father's words, about the legacy he had passed to her and the responsibility that came with it. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I will make you proud, Dad. I will teach them everything you taught me. I will pass it forward the way you wanted. And I will remember that the rifle is just a tool, that what matters is the hand that holds it and the heart that guides the hand." She touched the headstone once, cold marble under her fingers, and then she turned and walked away through the snow. Behind her, the grave would remain, marked with David Morgan's name and dates and the simple inscriptions she had chosen. Beloved father, honored warrior, teacher of eagles. But ahead of her was Fort Benning, and students waiting to learn, and a legacy that would live on through every shot they fired and every life they saved. That was how warriors live forever. Not through monuments or medals, but through the knowledge they passed on, the tradition they upheld, the chain that stretched back through generations and forward into a future no one could predict, but everyone hoped would be better. Rachel drove south through the snow, back to her duties, back to her students, back to the work her father had prepared her for. And somewhere in the mountains of Tennessee, the wind moved through the pines around an empty cabin, and a hawk circled overhead crying out to the cold December sky. And the snow kept falling, covering the old world with new white, offering the second chances that nature always promised and people sometimes accepted. The legacy would continue. The warriors would carry on. And David Morgan, who had lived as an eagle and died at peace, would watch it all from wherever it was the fallen went, proud beyond measure of the daughter who had taken everything he taught her and made it into something beautiful and necessary and true. The end was not an ending. It was a beginning. And that, Rachel knew as she drove through the snow toward a future her father would never see, was exactly what he would have wanted.